Have the systems and capacity in place to be able to meet the requirements of a major funder, whether that's fiduciary or, it's a complex reporting or even language barriers. And so that's when we said, okay, what if we got folks together in a room who come at this issue from different perspectives? The local institutions, the intermediary institutions, like, BRAC is on both sides of being an intermediary and a local institution. And IIED works kind of across the board as well as an intermediary and as a thought leader in this space. But with donors to iron out, okay, what are some of the specific ways to align how adaptation financing is done, align it with what the needs are on the ground and the reality of the capacities of local organizations, but in a way that also elevates and recognizes the insight and the knowledge that comes from local organizations. So I'll pause there. The survey was a key step in the process for what we wanted to do by hosting a convening at Bellagio. Thanks. Over to you, Saki. Bye.
Thank you. I hope this does not feedback as much. I'll talk loudly. Is that better? Thank you, Isabel. So that was a good segue into the activities, as you mentioned, in really understanding what are the different actors' roles, what are their limitations. Even though we do have quite a lot of friends and colleagues that are really working on these issues, trying to unpack them, trying to change that paradigm, trying to do things a bit differently, there are constraints. These are organizations that have big rules and procedures and a lot of due diligence that they need to go through. And again, there's a lot of due diligence that gets passed on down that chain, from the funder down to intermediaries, down towards local actors, and then that accountability chain that goes up the ranks as well. Oftentimes, it's not a very simple thing to just be changing one proposal draft or one guideline. It requires a lot of systemic issues that they need to be tackling. And that's really one of the things that we were trying to do in understanding what are those systemic processes, taking account that it will take time. It's not going to be a quick thing, but it will be a conversation that needs to be had. And we were very grateful to have quite a lot of respondents onto that survey. So maybe at this point, Larissa, if you could give us a little bit of an idea of what we were trying to gain from that survey, and then maybe we'll move on to May to give us a little bit of the outcomes that come through. What are some of the learnings that we captured through our activities there? Larissa, would you like to go ahead? We will mute on our side.
Absolutely. Thank you, Saqib. And hi, good afternoon to everyone. So just building off from what Isabel said, the survey was a key piece of this work that led us into the convening. In fact, in this survey, we did ask the question, an open question, as Saqib mentioned. It was a free survey accessible to all actors in the climate finance space. And the question was, what are the barriers to accessing climate finance? What is failing to get to the local level, to the people that are affected the most by climate finance, and impeding them to access the resources they need to lead these climate actions. So we've opened up the survey. I think it was open for a couple of months, and we have received responses from a vast range of actors. That includes funders, intermediaries, think tanks, local organizations, grassroots organizations that have flagged what in their experience were the barriers for them to access climate finance, effective climate finance. And some of the results that we've got were specifically with regards to the operational aspects of accessing climate finance, such as, for example, eligibility criteria, the application process, the length of the application process, the complexity of the application process for funding proposals, the technical knowledge needed, the criteria and due diligence aspects of applying to climate finance. Due diligence was a big one. Saqib Bhai mentioned this as well, but definitely the stringent criteria, the number of documents that are required from local organizations, intermediaries to to really be able to access these funding opportunities. And more generally, once these financing opportunities are accessed by communities and intermediaries and organizations, how flexible are the rules, the financial rules, the budgeting process? How flexible can we be in adjusting activities? I think there's a realization because of the lengthy application processes. We might be applying for funding this year, but then only be accepted in a couple of years' time. And priorities shift, needs shift. Their activities and the way we've presented our proposals and our projects have shifted. So how would then flexible be the funder in be willing to adjust, to adapt, and acknowledging that adaptation is a changing environment. We keep changing, we keep adjusting to the climate. So the actions that we put in practice also need to adjust, also need to be flexible. So how flexible will be the funder to respond to the needs and to the changing environment that we operate in? So I think that the survey really gave us a lot to think about, and also reflecting that a lot of the locally led adaptation principles are looking into operational aspects of how we put in place projects and how we develop proposals on how we budget for adaptation actions. And I'm not sure if I'm going ahead of myself, but I think the operational aspect was a key one for us to really make sure that locally led adaptation was moving forward. We have as of now, 140 endorses of the locally led adaptation principles, which is great, yay! However, we don't see that much change, and change often happens on the operational side of things, when we bring people on a journey with us, it's not just the champions, it's not just the people who believe in locally led adaptation, but it's also our colleagues sitting in finance, our colleagues sitting in compliance, and contracts. So there's a number of actors also that we need to influence and bring with us on this journey. And I'll stop there for now, Saqib, and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Larissa. I think that was a very good overview of the activities. What were some of the really critical elements that we decided on focusing on? Because again, there's quite a lot of broad things that we really did start off with in the initial planning. But I think it was also critical for us to, as you mentioned, come down into the operationalization. What are the different things that we could actually make as changes? And what are some of the different things that other participants, other actors, and as you mentioned, the intermediaries as well, what are the operationalized things that we could make as impactful changes? Understanding that there's a broad range of things that need to be changed in the system at large, but operationalization is a really critical part of being able to make sure that we're able to put these things into practice. How quick can those things happen? What are those stopgaps immediately for those small gains, the low-hanging fruit in the activities that we're doing, and for the funders to understand that there are low-hanging fruits that they can make changes to. So in that, maybe the outcomes that we've got from some of the survey results, May, if I could allude to you to give us a little bit of what was coming through as we were hearing from people about what were some of the issues that they were facing, but what are the solutions and areas that might have come through as well as people are working on these issues. May, over to you.
Yeah, so I've actually put the results of the survey in the chat so everyone can have a look at it. Larissa's already mentioned some of the meaty issues that surfaced from the survey. We asked for very practical operational issues that people could identify as blockages to LLA. So we wanted the survey to be sort of like an advocacy tool to consolidate a couple of key messages that we could take forward to donors. And so we came up with maybe two types of key messages. One, easy wins for donors to uptake the survey and implement immediately. And so based on the survey results, we called for donors to accept applications in multiple languages, an easy win, simplify application processes so that it's not convoluted, it's not multi-stage, it's not, multiple pages long, to simplify it for different organizations at the local level to access. And then also focus on accessible communications. So have the call for proposals be more known by local organizations in local languages so that they know where to apply and how to apply. So these are the easy wins that we came up with, and those are the key messages around the easy wins. But then we also came up with 3 key messages that were a bit more reach goals for donors and intermediaries. And these are around widening the eligibility criteria so that a wider pool of candidates can apply for these types of proposals for climate funds, to prioritize local organizations. So usually funders will have calls for proposals that are just sort of broad. And so if these calls for proposals could target, Bangladesh, local organizations, women's groups in Bangladesh, for example, they would be more targeted and they would be more accessible by the organizations that need it the most. So these are the kinds of messages that we're pushing. And then maybe a longer term goal to work towards is calling for funders to restructure due diligence. So all of the onerous, really burdensome things that come with reporting, minimizing risk, all of those things, they require local organizations to put a lot of time, personnel, and investment into. And so we want there to be more trust by donors so that they can restructure the processes and make it easier for local organizations to receive the funds and use the funds that they provide. Saqib and I were talking a little bit before about how useful is this survey. Is this useful to have this survey year after year? And I think it is. I think the great utility of the survey is coming up with these key messages. So if you guys are working at local organizations and you want to use these key messages to hold donors accountable, you can. What would be really great for us as an advocacy tool is to have some examples from local organizations of these key messages that we've asked donors. So, for example, are local organizations restructuring due diligence already, and they have successful examples of how they've managed to work to simplify processes. We'd love to hear about these examples so that when we have advocacy to donors to change their practices, we can say, here are local organizations from Bangladesh, women groups that are doing this already, and we want you to adopt these. So that would be the next stage for the survey.
Thank you, May. And I echo that sentiment. I think, a lot of the times we get put into these projectized modes where you're just doing one-off activities just for the duration of the project and just something is happening at that time as a demand, as an activity. But really, it's very difficult to get that kind of momentum. So it was really great to have as many respondents and as many participants on the survey as we did. But really, if that is something that we do as an iteration, learning from one survey, learning from one group of respondents, and then shaping the next surveys, that's really where we at ICCCAD feel that that's where the learning is embedded. It takes a little while for that momentum to build. It takes a little while for people to really understand what are the things that they can put in and the challenges, as May mentioned, to give us that example. We may not have as many actors at the local level that have those kinds of experiences and are willing to share. But then as we have more and more people and more results coming through, it really does give that sort of show organizations that this is a common challenge. This isn't just something that because our institution is lacking something, we don't have that capacity. We aren't able to make that proposal happen. But this is something that is common amongst a lot of our stakeholders, not only for us to understand, but then also find out those stakeholders, having these results as something that we see as a way for other people to learn from. So again, an experience that you've had, how difficult it was to go through an application process or get into a networking meeting, a stakeholder meeting, and be able to share that experience for other partners. We had a number of conversations, as I mentioned, during our workshop, where we had a diverse group of stakeholders being able to share those on-the-ground experiences. A lot of us organizations that had that kind of challenge even as think tanks like us that apply for a lot of these grant funds, work with a lot of these donors, and have been doing so over a number of years and decades, but still face challenges, still not being able to do them timely, still not being able to get into the right funding calls at the right time, being able to work with the right partners. And that was one of the convening outcomes. So maybe Larissa, if you'd like to give us a little bit of a thinking of how we were shaping and looking at for that, and who showed up at the convening and the discussions that we had. I'll come over to one of our panelists after this. Larissa, to you.
Thank you, Saqib. As I was mentioning earlier, a lot of the barriers that were identified were operational barriers, and I speak from a program management perspective. I deal with operations every day, and I see a lot of our work or a lot of the policies and processes that we have in place not walking the talk on a locally led adaptation. So I think one of the suggestions for this workshop in Bellagio, and I think the innovative aspect of the workshop was to go beyond the usual suspects, the champions that we constantly speak to and keep sort of reinforcing the message of locally led adaptation, but bring also some of those colleagues that sit in other departments that are not necessarily familiar with the principles, that are not necessarily working with the principles on a day-to-day basis. And maybe even though they think in principle it's great, they not necessarily strive to implement them in their day-to-day work. So we, as part of the participants list, we were trying to make sure that for each organization or for some of the organizations, we would have a champion of the locally led adaptation principles. So, for example, someone working in the strategic departments, a technical researcher, a policy advisor, but that person to be then accompanied by a colleague that sits in an operational department. So a due diligence person or a grant management person or a finance and compliance person to really bring them in this journey with us and try to flesh out with them what are the possibilities in the realms of processes and systems that organizations have in place to really shift this power dynamics, to really move towards business unusual. So we've had a few representatives in the convening with us from bilateral organizations that were grant managers, that were contracts and compliance managers that really were on board with this thinking, and while they were in the room with us, we're thinking, well, actually, we can try and advocate for more languages in the application processes. We can actually try and work together to build a due diligence process that speak to each other. So if Larissa goes and asks funding from May and then from Isabel, they speak to each other in terms of the requirements and documents that they will be asking of Larissa or of an applicant. So unifying those due diligence systems, unifying those processes so that Larissa doesn't have to do a million things differently, but she's already put in place a proposal and already has documents and already knows how the system works. And that makes access to funding more easy. So I think maybe just to wrap it up, we were really trying to see what are the low-hanging fruits that some organizations have and work together with their operational people to really move forward from within the organization, this LLA movement, going beyond the technical and champions of the principles itself. Back to you, Saqib.
Sorry for that. Thank you, Larissa. And again, just to echo on some of the reflections that I personally had while we were at the convening was, just to be able to understand what is the business as usual now, what are the things that we're trying to do in terms of being able to make those changes happen. But again, also because of the people that are working on these areas, there are experience and innovations that people are testing and trying out themselves today is one of our ones. We're a research and capacity building think tank, and we try and change the paradigm and thinking about how capacity building can be done a bit differently. But in terms of a number of the funders that were involved in this process with us during the convening, one of the things that was really innovative for us was to work with one of the Indigenous Peoples Fund. This is a fund called Pawanka Fund that works on Indigenous peoples, territories, and communities, and really tries to look at the funding perspective for communities that are from Indigenous peoples and territories in their challenges, being able to frame proposals, being able to do funding that are geared to the needs for those communities that can be different to other mainstream communities and local actors that are involved. But really, what are the ways that they can be given a little bit more strategic guidance, a little bit more strategic focus, as we mentioned in a number of areas, having those very specific thematic calls, having those very specific funding proposals, calls for actions. In those ways, it might be a better way for us to try and bring in these local actors and communities. And oftentimes what we see in mainstream proposals is that Indigenous peoples, communities, and territories often get overlooked in a number of the funding circles that we see, particularly when you're looking at the very large global funds coming down at the national, then at the local level. So that was one of the learnings that we had in our conversations with people on what are the different ways that we can set up these smaller funds, make them a little bit more targeted, and what are the ways that these rules and regulations can really adapt and change and adhere to the communities that they're really trying to serve. So that is what we call a part of our learning journey, not just being able to give and impart the knowledge to people, but what are the ways that we can learn from others? What are the innovations and activities that they're doing? So with that, maybe I'll plug in Isabel, as we have a actor from a multi-country NGO working on a number of different areas. If you'd like to talk to us a little bit about the learning journeys and how you guys are operationalizing this in the number of areas and communities and countries that you're working in. Isabel?
Sure. I mean, I can speak to how we are trying to apply the philosophy of this effort into this multi-country program, and then perhaps May can speak to the specific learning journey that that emerged from the Bellagio convening. So yeah, what we're trying to do is, or what we are doing is crafting a new multi-country locally led adaptation program at BRAC, which will specifically focus on women in agriculture. And that's to recognize that national adaptation plans in a number of developing countries and the countries that we work in consistently identify agriculture as a priority area for governments to see adaptation in. And so the vision is a multi-country integrated program where we will partner with local actors in 4 countries. And we're going to be, or we are co-creating this with donor partners. And so that our priorities are aligned from the outset. And we're trying to do this in a way where implementers, BRAC and other local partners, are not responding to whatever it is donors are listening and saying that they want to fund, but rather spending time in the communities that we work in, listening to what the challenges are faced by women who are the most impacted by climate change, hearing what they need to be able to adapt, pairing that with evidence of what has worked for that group of people, speaking with local academic institutions, and crafting a locally led adaptation program that truly comes from the ground, and then bringing that to donors and working that through with donors, as opposed to the other way around, where we would be responding to calls, which is still typical in the space. So yeah, it will be a large program. It will require multiple donor partners. And so then that also means we'll need to work together on, what reporting arrangements look like that work for the group, implementers and the donors, as opposed to having to respond to very specific reporting arrangements from each individual donor, which simply isn't efficient for anyone. I want to acknowledge, obviously we're operating in a very difficult time in the space for development actors and actors working in adaptation. But I do feel like actually the challenges that we're seeing actually makes an even stronger case for locally led adaptation, right? It's about investing in local capacity, smaller institutions where money can actually go further. It's about delivering financing with fewer administrative strings attached and in a more efficient way. and doing it in alignment from the outset with local priorities and including national policies, which will, positions you for longer term commitment and sustainability. But in making that case for why LLA is very much in the interests of donors, that's where we talked about having a learning journey would be really, really beneficial to kind of have a clearer narrative. So maybe with that, May, if I can bounce that over to you. Thanks.
Yeah, I can give a little bit of a historical context to this term learning journey. It was in 2001 when the principles were launched. Salim Hook and our previous director of the climate change group, Claire Shakya, envisaged this vision of a learning journey, which is where, okay, there are endorsers of LLA that endorse the principles, but where is the action around LLA? So they envisaged this 10-year learning journey from 2021 to really make sure that we use different moments in the year, milestone events, including Gobeshona, to share learning around LLA and scale it up. We've built on this thinking of the learning journey since then, and we really wanted to be a learning journey where not only people share learning, but also hold each other accountable. So we have this concept of a 360 accountability approach where it's not just donors trying to implement LLA or just local actors doing LLA. It's more an approach where people are mutually accountable for doing LLA together within climate projects and climate programs. So the learning journey is now a movement where we are trying to get the actors involved in climate projects, so a climate delivery chain, we're calling it, and sharing learning with one another and trying to move actions, progress actions forward on implementing locally led adaptation. So Gobeshona is one of the learning events, and here we are sharing what we've learned from events like Bellagio, learning from one another about how to implement LLA, how to bring in different themes around loss and damage. That's what you all are doing now. The next event will be the Community-Based Adaptation Conference, which is a global practitioner conference where communities at the front lines that are actually doing climate adaptation have a chance to come together and share their learning around what makes locally led adaptation possible. And the Community-Based Adaptation Conference has also been growing in its scope, where it used to be more practitioner focused. Now we have more of this 360 mutual accountability, where more intermediaries are coming, donors are coming as well. So communities can be a part of the system of holding donors and intermediaries accountable to putting in place LLA and the LLA actions. And the final moments in the learning journey are DNC days and events around COP, where we can make public announcements, bring together more wider community of practice of LLA practitioners to really move forward on actions around locally led adaptation. And the learning journey is evolving. It's now more focused on accountability, but we have more partners than ever to really move forward actions around LLA, different subsects of communities of practice where donors are forming their own subsector community of practice where they're working on things that donors themselves can do. We also have an online community of practice, which has a broader range of actors that share learnings around LLA. So I guess I encourage all of you to be part of the community of practice and share learning around LLA and trying to hold donors, well, each other accountable for moving LLA forward.
Thank you, May. And also, as you mentioned, this is the part of the learning journey that we really do like to focus on in being able to unpack some of the challenges, unpack some of the things that we're talking about. So I'm very grateful for a number of our partners that have worked throughout the conference session for a lot of the thematic areas, a lot of the theoretical work that they're doing. And there are a number of sessions on LLA where people have come in to talk about the challenges that they faced in their activities and what are the different challenges that they would like to address. So again, for the benefit of everybody in the room as well as online that are following these activities on LLA, there are a number of sessions that you could go through for this year's conference if you're interested. But then we have a whole wealth of over the last 4 years of sessions that we've hosted online where you can equally go ahead and reach out to the partners, reach out to those researchers, reach out to those funders that have presented, that have showcased a little bit of their work, and really engage with them, but then also talk with them about what they have done differently. What are the ways that they have learned? What are the things that they have put into practice? And if there are ways that you can engage or we can collaborate, happily to take that forward on that journey with us. And as May mentioned, this is just a step into the journey. We usually try to have the online physical virtual conference here at the first half of the year, but then we will be moving into the more practitioners-led, more practical experiences on the CBA conferences, which will be in its 19th edition this year, I believe, is a long-standing practitioners global community, where again, a number of these influences and responses do start to come through and activities start coming in letting us know what are the ways that practitioners have been putting these into place and how we can best learn from that. So thank you, May, for highlighting the journey throughout the year. And I'd like to maybe from a room open it up if there are any queries or questions that they would like to have in the activities that our partners have spoken about, some of the work that we've been doing, but in other ways, if you have any open questions as to what they are thinking about, strategizing, what are the different things that you as early practitioners might be able to take forward. I'd like to open the room for any questions if there's anything here, even online if there are any attendees that would like to write in the chat. Any hands? I think it's been a long day here. You know they can see you, right? I'll give it 2 more seconds. Great. With that being said, maybe just any final remarks to our panelists online. Anything else that you would like to have as a send-off before we close the room, give them a little bit of a break and a refreshment over here, but then for the online participants to take a break before the next sessions kick on. Panelists, friends, any last words?
I'm just going to post a link in the chat. There's some fantastic championship coming from the Danish government, with whom we just published an op-ed on the need for locally led adaptation solutions for women farmers. So I'll share that now.
Thank you. And again, also for both the messages on the chat, we will be sure to share it with our participants here. But again, for those of us that are online, you can find them on the Zoom chat link later on. May.
Yeah, I can mention a little bit about the specific accountability work that IED is doing. So we are developing indicators on what LLA looks like, and we were able to work in Bangladesh to test out with communities what does accountability look like and develop some indicators from Bangladesh. So we are now taking these indicators and developing a toolkit for holding donors and intermediaries accountable. So if you're interested in indicators, accountability, trying to understand what communities think of is locally led adaptation, do reach out to Savio, who was the case study lead, and Afsara. ICCCAD was very much involved in the initial development of the indicators, or you can reach out to us at IED to have more conversations on this indicator work.
Thank you, May. Savio's right at the back of the room, so thank you for plugging him. Also, if you are interested, do reach out to us if you would like to get in touch with any of our panelists as well. Their names and details are on the conference flyer and sessions, but you're welcome to go and reach out to them if you would like. Happy to make those linkages as well. Larissa, any final words?
Just a final word to say, I've put in the chat a link to the Community-Based Adaptation Conference, which will start on the 12th of May. It will be in Brazil this year, so the first time in the Latin American continent. It's fully sold out, so we don't have many spaces left. However, we'll be live streaming the plenary sessions and each day publishing the key messages and information that is coming from the brilliant conversations that we'll be having there. So just a plug to the conference and to share the link with everyone in the room. But thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, everybody on the panel, and thank you, everybody in the room. So with that, I'd like to maybe conclude on the live Zoom broadcasting session over here, as well as for the participants. I will hand over to my colleagues at the back of the room. Mohima, would you like to come up? I'm handing over to you, or Savio. Thank you, everybody. We'll be ending the session here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much. Bye.
Bye.